The year 2024 will be remembered as one of global upheaval, rising tensions, and dramatic geopolitical change. Across multiple continents, conflicts escalated, alliances shifted, and fragile peace agreements began to crack under pressure. Political intrigue, economic instability, and military confrontations became part of everyday international headlines. Yet, as serious and dangerous as 2024 was, many analysts now believe that 2025 may prove even more volatile. The trends emerging today suggest that several major conflicts are approaching critical turning points, while older trouble spots show signs of reigniting into full-scale crises. History often gives each year a defining moment of global importance. In 2021, the world watched the rapid collapse of Afghanistan's government and the return of the Taliban after the withdrawal of American and Western forces. In 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, reshaping European security and triggering the largest land war on the continent since World War II. In 2023, the massive Hamas attack on Israel in October led to devastating warfare in Gaza and reshaped Middle Eastern politics. In 2024, despite intense competition from several major conflicts, the most pivotal moment was the sudden collapse of the Syrian government after nearly 14 years of civil war. For more than a decade, Syria had been locked in a brutal and complex war involving the government of President Bashar al-Assad, multiple rebel groups, extremist organizations, and foreign powers. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, millions were displaced, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. For years, the conflict appeared frozen in a stalemate, with Assad controlling major cities while opposition forces held pockets of territory in the north and east. Few expected a rapid conclusion. Yet, in the final weeks of 2024, a powerful rebel coalition launched a lightning offensive that overwhelmed government defenses. Within less than 2 weeks, key military positions collapsed, government authority disintegrated, and Assad's regime effectively ceased to exist. The Syrian Arab Republic, as it had existed for decades, was fundamentally transformed. The speed of the collapse shocked the international community and forced governments to reassess their policies toward Syria almost overnight. In the immediate aftermath, global attention turned toward the identity and intentions of the rebel leadership. Many of the commanders had past connections to extremist movements, including former links to al-Qaeda. This raised serious concerns about whether the new authorities would govern responsibly or pursue radical agendas. Diplomats, intelligence agencies, and international organizations rushed to analyze their ideology, leadership structure, and long-term goals. Surprisingly, the early signals from the new Syrian leadership were cautiously positive. They emphasized stability, reconstruction, and cooperation with international institutions. The United Nations, the United States, European governments, and several Middle Eastern states began coordinated diplomatic efforts aimed at stabilizing the country, delivering humanitarian aid, and encouraging the return of millions of Syrian refugees who had fled to neighboring countries and Europe. A key objective of these diplomatic efforts was to prevent Syria from becoming a playground for foreign proxy conflicts once again. Many international actors hoped to reduce the influence of Russia and Iran, both of which had strongly supported Assad during the war. With Assad gone, there was an opportunity to reshape Syria's future in a way that might promote regional stability and reduce external military involvement. However, declaring the Syrian civil war over would be premature. Beneath the surface of diplomatic optimism lies a fragile and deeply unstable reality. Two major flashpoints continue to threaten Syria's future: tensions between Turkey and Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and the possible resurgence of the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. The Kurdish population in northern Syria established a semi-autonomous region during the civil war, commonly referred to as Rojava. Kurdish forces, organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces, played a critical role in defeating ISIS with support from the United States and its allies. They developed relatively stable local governance structures, maintained security in their territories, and managed large detention camps holding captured ISIS fighters and their families. Despite this cooperation with Western powers, Turkey has long viewed these Kurdish groups as an extension of militant organizations that operate inside Turkish territory. For decades, Turkey has fought an internal conflict against Kurdish separatist movements and considers any armed Kurdish autonomy near its borders to be a direct security threat. As a result, Turkish forces have repeatedly conducted cross-border operations into northern Syria and established buffer zones to push Kurdish fighters away from the border. Following the fall of Assad's regime, tensions between Turkey and Kurdish forces intensified. Turkish-backed Syrian militias resumed limited attacks against Kurdish positions, and both sides mobilized forces near key strategic towns. A fragile ceasefire currently exists, but it is widely considered temporary and unstable. If fighting resumes, many experts believe the city of Kobani could become the focal point of a major confrontation. Kobani holds symbolic and strategic value, as it was once the site of a decisive battle against ISIS and lies close to the Turkish border. Political signals also suggest that Kurdish forces may face declining international support. Several Western governments have indicated that the strategic conditions that justified Kurdish autonomy during the fight against ISIS have changed. With Assad removed and a transitional government forming in Damascus, some countries may prioritize restoring centralized authority rather than maintaining Kurdish self-rule. Turkey has publicly demanded that Kurdish forces disarm and dissolve their military structures, insisting that foreign fighters leave Syrian territory permanently. If a large-scale Turkish offensive occurs, Kurdish forces would face overwhelming military pressure. Turkey possesses superior air power, artillery, and armored units, and enjoys significant regional political influence. While Kurdish fighters are experienced and highly motivated, they may struggle to resist sustained Turkish operations without strong international backing. The most likely outcome would be Turkish dominance over the region, though the humanitarian cost could be severe, including civilian displacement and loss of life. At the same time, the threat of ISIS has not disappeared. Although the organization lost its territorial caliphate years ago, it never fully vanished. Instead, it adapted into a decentralized insurgency operating in desert regions and rural areas. Recent intelligence indicates that ISIS activity increased significantly in 2024 compared to previous years, signaling renewed organizational strength. Kurdish forces currently guard approximately 9,000 imprisoned ISIS fighters, along with tens of thousands of detainees in camps, many of whom remain ideologically loyal to the group. As Kurdish units shift their focus toward defending against Turkey, resources dedicated to guarding these facilities are being reduced. There have already been attempted prison break incidents, raising fears that mass escapes could occur. While the Middle East struggles to stabilize after years of war, another dangerous hotspot continues to grow quietly but steadily in East Asia. The Korean Peninsula, technically still at war since the Korean War ended in an armistice rather than a peace treaty in 1953, remains one of the most militarized regions on Earth. In 2025, this long-standing standoff between North Korea and South Korea has entered a new and particularly risky phase. North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Jong-un, has accelerated its weapons development program at an unprecedented pace. Over the past few years, Pyongyang has conducted numerous missile tests, including intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States, as well as hypersonic weapons designed to evade missile defense systems. These tests are often accompanied by aggressive political statements warning of preemptive nuclear action if North Korea perceives any threat to its sovereignty. South Korea, supported by the United States, has responded by strengthening its own military readiness. Joint military exercises between American and South Korean forces have increased in scale and frequency. Advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, and naval assets have been deployed throughout the region. While these exercises are officially defensive, North Korea views them as rehearsals for invasion, further fueling mistrust and hostility. The risk in Korea does not necessarily come from a deliberate decision to start a war. Instead, the greatest danger lies in miscalculation and escalation. A small incident, such as an artillery exchange near the demilitarized zone, a naval collision in disputed waters, or a missile test that accidentally crosses into restricted airspace, could rapidly spiral out of control. In such a tense environment, political leaders may feel pressured to respond forcefully in order to maintain credibility at home and abroad. Complicating the situation further are the strategic interests of China and Russia. Both countries maintain complex relationships with North Korea. China views the Korean Peninsula as a critical buffer zone separating it from U.S. military forces stationed in South Korea. Beijing fears that a collapse of the North Korean regime could lead to chaos, refugee flows, and the expansion of American influence directly on its border. As a result, China provides limited economic and political support to North Korea, even while publicly calling for stability and restraint. Russia, increasingly isolated from the West due to the Ukraine war, has also strengthened its ties with North Korea. Reports suggest that Moscow and Pyongyang have exchanged military technology, ammunition, and political backing. This growing cooperation adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile region. Any conflict on the Korean Peninsula could quickly involve multiple great powers, raising the risk of a much wider confrontation. Analysts warn that 2025 could become a critical year for Korea. If North Korea continues expanding its nuclear arsenal and delivery systems, pressure will grow on South Korea and the United States to enhance deterrence measures even further. Some voices in South Korea have even called for developing an independent nuclear capability, a move that would significantly alter regional security dynamics and alarm neighboring countries. At the same time, internal conditions inside North Korea remain difficult. Economic sanctions, limited trade, food shortages, and strict government controls continue to strain the population. Historically, authoritarian regimes sometimes use external threats to consolidate internal control and redirect public frustration. This dynamic increases the risk that North Korea may deliberately provoke confrontations to strengthen domestic legitimacy. While East Asia faces these mounting dangers, Europe's southeastern region, the Balkans, is also experiencing renewed instability. The Balkans have long been a crossroads of cultures, religions, and empires, but they have also been the site of repeated conflicts. The violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s left deep scars, unresolved grievances, and fragile political arrangements that continue to shape the region today. In recent years, tensions have intensified, particularly between Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo declared independence from Serbia in 2008, a move recognized by many Western countries, but rejected by Serbia and several of its allies. Ethnic Serbs living in northern Kosovo maintain strong ties to Belgrade and often resist integration into Kosovo's political system. Periodic protests, road blockades, and clashes with police have become increasingly common. In 2024, several confrontations raised alarms across Europe. Armed incidents near border areas, attacks on security forces, and inflammatory nationalist rhetoric signaled a dangerous escalation. Serbian military units were observed conducting large-scale exercises near the Kosovo border, prompting NATO peacekeeping forces to increase their presence as a deterrent. Bosnia and Herzegovina represents another fragile fault line. The country's complex political structure, created after the Dayton Accords ended the Bosnian War in 1995, divides power among different ethnic groups. In recent years, nationalist leaders in the Serb-dominated Republika Srpska have openly discussed secession, threatening to undermine the country's territorial integrity. Such moves alarm both domestic communities and international observers, who fear a return to ethnic violence. The broader geopolitical environment has also influenced Balkan instability. Russia has sought to expand its influence in the region by supporting nationalist political actors and spreading disinformation, aiming to weaken NATO and European Union cohesion. Meanwhile, the European Union's slow progress in integrating Balkan states has generated frustration and uncertainty, leaving political vacuums that external actors can exploit. If violence were to erupt in the Balkans, it could quickly draw in international forces. NATO maintains peacekeeping missions in Kosovo and Bosnia, and any direct attack on these forces could trigger broader military responses. Moreover, instability in the Balkans could disrupt trade routes, energy infrastructure, and migration flows across Europe, amplifying its impact beyond the region itself. One of the greatest dangers in both Korea and the Balkans is the role of nationalism and historical memory. Political leaders sometimes invoke past grievances and cultural identity to mobilize public support, but this rhetoric can harden divisions and reduce the space for compromise. Once public emotions are inflamed, even pragmatic leaders may find it difficult to step back from confrontation without appearing weak. Despite these risks, diplomatic efforts continue behind the scenes. In Korea, back-channel communications, confidence-building measures, and crisis hotlines aim to prevent accidental escalation. In the Balkans, European mediators, NATO officials, and regional leaders regularly engage in negotiations designed to de-escalate tensions and promote economic cooperation. However, diplomacy requires patience, trust, and political courage, qualities often in short supply during periods of heightened insecurity. As 2025 unfolds, the Korean Peninsula and the Balkans stand as stark reminders that peace can never be taken for granted. In both regions, the margin for error is dangerously thin. As the world watches flashpoints in East Asia and the Balkans, another major geopolitical theater continues to shape global security: Eastern Europe. The war in Ukraine, which began with Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, has already altered military doctrine, economic alliances, and diplomatic relations worldwide. By the end of 2024, the conflict had settled into a grinding war of attrition, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Entering 2025, the possibility of a negotiated settlement exists, but it carries deep uncertainty and potential long-term risks. After years of intense fighting, both Ukraine and Russia face significant exhaustion. Ukraine has suffered massive infrastructure damage, population displacement, and economic strain. Russia, while maintaining territorial gains in some regions, has endured heavy casualties, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation from much of the Western world. International support for Ukraine remains strong, but political fatigue is becoming visible in some donor countries, especially as domestic economic pressures grow. These conditions have created space for renewed diplomatic efforts. Several international mediators have proposed ceasefire frameworks aimed at freezing current front lines and opening the door to broader negotiations. Such a deal might involve security guarantees for Ukraine, partial lifting of sanctions on Russia, and internationally monitored demilitarized zones. While these proposals are still hypothetical, growing pressure for de-escalation suggests that some form of agreement in 2025 is possible. However, any peace deal would likely be imperfect and controversial. If Russia retains control over occupied territories, many Ukrainians would view the outcome as unjust and unstable. Frozen conflicts often create long-term resentment and unresolved grievances, making future violence more likely rather than less. Historical examples in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus demonstrate that unresolved territorial disputes can reignite years or even decades later when political conditions shift. Another concern is the potential signal such a settlement might send globally. If territorial conquest through force is perceived as successful or partially rewarded, it could embolden other states to pursue aggressive policies. This dynamic could weaken international norms that protect sovereignty and territorial integrity, leading to increased instability in other regions. At the same time, a ceasefire could provide Ukraine with much-needed time to rebuild infrastructure, strengthen institutions, and deepen integration with European political and economic structures. Reconstruction efforts would require massive investment, international coordination, and long-term political stability. Whether Ukraine can achieve this while living under the shadow of a powerful neighbor remains uncertain. Russia's future trajectory is equally unclear. Prolonged war has reshaped its economy, defense industry, and foreign partnerships. Closer ties with China, Iran, and North Korea reflect a broader realignment away from Western systems. Internal political pressures, demographic trends, and economic constraints could influence Moscow's strategic decisions in unpredictable ways. A pause in fighting may allow Russia to regroup militarily and politically, potentially preparing for renewed confrontation in the future. Beyond Ukraine, the South Caucasus presents another fragile zone of instability, particularly between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These two countries have long disputed the status of Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding territories. Although Azerbaijan regained significant control during recent conflicts, unresolved border demarcations, transport corridors, and security arrangements continue to fuel tension. One of the most sensitive issues involves proposed transit routes linking Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhchivan through Armenian territory. Azerbaijan views these corridors as essential for economic integration and regional connectivity. Armenia, however, fears that such arrangements could undermine its sovereignty and security. Negotiations have repeatedly stalled, and periodic skirmishes along the border have kept tensions high. Regional powers play a critical role in shaping the South Caucasus dynamic. Turkey strongly supports Azerbaijan, providing military training, technology, and diplomatic backing. Iran, which shares borders with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, worries about changing regional power balances and potential threats to its own security interests. Russia traditionally acted as a security guarantor in the region, but its focus on Ukraine has reduced its ability to enforce stability, creating a power vacuum. This vacuum increases the risk of miscalculation. Without a strong and trusted mediator, even minor incidents could escalate rapidly. A renewed conflict in the South Caucasus would not only destabilize local populations, but could also disrupt energy corridors connecting the Caspian region to European markets. Such disruptions would carry global economic implications, particularly for energy security. Another layer of complexity arises from domestic politics within both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Leaders face pressure from nationalist constituencies that demand firm stances on territorial issues. Political compromise is often framed as weakness, limiting the flexibility of negotiators. Media narratives and social media amplification further intensify public emotions, making pragmatic solutions harder to achieve. The broader international community has attempted to facilitate dialogue through diplomatic platforms, economic incentives, and confidence-building measures. However, sustained engagement requires long-term commitment and regional trust, both of which are fragile in a polarized global environment. Without meaningful progress toward a comprehensive settlement, the South Caucasus may remain a persistent source of instability throughout 2025 and beyond. The interconnected nature of these conflicts highlights a key characteristic of the modern world. Regional crises rarely remain isolated. The war in Ukraine affects energy prices, food supply chains, defense spending, and political alliances far beyond Europe. Similarly, instability in the South Caucasus influences transportation routes, regional security balances, and diplomatic alignments involving multiple neighboring powers. Furthermore, the increasing use of drones, cyber operations, and information warfare blurs traditional boundaries between peace and conflict. Even during periods of formal ceasefire, states may continue to engage in covert competition, undermining trust and increasing the risk of sudden escalation. This environment challenges existing international institutions that were designed for a different era of warfare and diplomacy. As 2025 progresses, policymakers face difficult trade-offs between deterrence and diplomacy, national interests and collective security, short-term stability and long-term justice. The choices made in Ukraine and the South Caucasus will influence global norms and expectations for years to come. Whether the international system can adapt to these pressures without descending into wider conflict remains one of the defining questions of our time. In the next part, we will examine emerging security challenges in the Western Hemisphere and Africa, including cartel violence in Mexico, humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, and growing instability in Ethiopia, regions often overlooked but increasingly central to global security. While much of the world's attention remains focused on Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, powerful security challenges are unfolding across the Western Hemisphere and Africa. These regions often receive less international coverage, yet their instability has far-reaching consequences for migration, trade, humanitarian conditions, and global security. In 2025, 3 areas in particular demand urgent attention: cartel violence in Mexico, the deepening humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, and the growing instability in Ethiopia. Mexico has long struggled with organized crime and powerful drug cartels, but recent years have seen a sharp escalation in violence, sophistication, and territorial control by criminal organizations. Cartels now operate not only as trafficking networks, but as heavily armed paramilitary groups that challenge state authority in entire regions. They control smuggling routes, extort local businesses, infiltrate police forces, and sometimes function as shadow governments in rural and urban communities alike. The economic incentives driving cartel activity remain enormous. Demand for narcotics in North America and beyond continues to generate billions of dollars annually. At the same time, human smuggling, weapons trafficking, fuel theft, and cybercrime have diversified cartel revenue streams. These financial resources allow criminal groups to recruit, arm, and corrupt with alarming efficiency. In 2024, several high-profile incidents underscored the deteriorating security environment in Mexico. armed confrontations in major cities, attacks on journalists and politicians, and the temporary shutdown of transportation networks demonstrated the cartel's ability to disrupt daily life and challenge federal authority. Some regions experienced near-continuous fighting between rival groups competing for territory and influence. Looking toward 2025, concerns are growing about potential external involvement, particularly from the United States. Cross-border trafficking, fentanyl distribution, and migrant flows have become major political issues in American domestic politics. Some policymakers have proposed more aggressive measures against cartel infrastructure, including intelligence operations, economic pressure, and even limited cross-border strikes. While such proposals remain controversial, any direct foreign involvement could dramatically alter Mexico's internal security dynamics and raise sensitive sovereignty concerns. A further risk lies in the fragmentation of cartel organizations. When major leaders are captured or killed, splintered groups often emerge, creating unpredictable violence rather than stability. Local communities become trapped between rival factions and government forces, leading to displacement, economic decline, and erosion of trust in institutions. Without comprehensive judicial reform, economic development, and anti-corruption efforts, purely military approaches are unlikely to deliver lasting solutions. Across the Atlantic, Sudan represents one of the world's gravest humanitarian emergencies. Years of political instability, economic mismanagement, and internal power struggles erupted into full-scale conflict between rival military factions. Cities have been devastated, essential services collapsed, and millions of civilians displaced. Food systems have been disrupted, healthcare infrastructure destroyed, and humanitarian access severely restricted. By late 2024, international organizations warned of famine conditions affecting large segments of the population. Malnutrition rates among children reached alarming levels, and preventable diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded displacement camps. Aid convoys face security threats, bureaucratic obstacles, and funding shortages, limiting their ability to reach vulnerable populations. The conflict in Sudan also carries regional implications. Neighboring countries face refugee influxes that strain their own limited resources. Arms trafficking, cross-border militias, and political spillover risk destabilizing already fragile regions. The Red Sea corridor, a critical global shipping route, could also face indirect security challenges if instability deepens. Diplomatic efforts to mediate ceasefires and political agreements have struggled due to fragmented leadership, competing interests among external actors, and lack of enforcement mechanisms. While international pressure continues, sustainable peace requires internal political compromise, accountability, and long-term economic recovery, goals that remain difficult amid ongoing violence. Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous country, faces its own complex web of challenges. Although a major civil war formally ended with a peace agreement, underlying tensions persist across multiple regions. Ethnic divisions, competition over land and political power, and unresolved grievances continue to fuel localized conflicts. Armed groups operate in several areas, and humanitarian needs remain substantial. Ethiopia's strategic importance amplifies these risks. The country sits at the heart of the Horn of Africa, influencing regional trade routes, water resources, and security arrangements. Disputes over the Nile River and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam continue to affect relations with downstream countries, particularly Egypt and Sudan. Water security, climate stress, and population growth compound these geopolitical pressures. Internal instability in Ethiopia could trigger broader regional consequences, including refugee flows, economic disruption, and increased competition among neighboring states for influence. International peacekeeping and mediation efforts face limitations due to sovereignty sensitivities and the complexity of local political dynamics. A common thread linking Mexico, Sudan, and Ethiopia is the erosion of state capacity under pressure from violence, economic strain, and governance challenges. When institutions weaken, non-state actors, whether criminal organizations, militias, or insurgent groups, fill the vacuum. Rebuilding trust in governance requires not only security measures, but also inclusive political processes, economic opportunity, and social cohesion. Another emerging factor shaping instability is climate stress. Extreme weather events, droughts, and resource scarcity intensify existing tensions, particularly in vulnerable regions. Competition over water, arable land, and food supplies can accelerate conflict dynamics, pushing communities toward migration or armed confrontation. These pressures intersect with political fragility in ways that traditional security strategies often struggle to address. The international community faces difficult choices in responding to these crises. Humanitarian assistance remains essential, but insufficient without political solutions. Military interventions carry high risks of unintended consequences, while diplomatic engagement requires patience and sustained commitment. Economic investment, governance reform, and regional cooperation offer long-term pathways, but demand coordination and political will. As global attention remains divided among multiple flashpoints, there is a risk that slow-burning crises receive inadequate resources and policy focus until they reach catastrophic levels. The interconnected nature of global systems means that instability in one region can cascade through migration patterns, supply chains, financial markets, and security alliances. As 2025 unfolds, the Middle East remains one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the world. Although some of the intense fighting seen in previous years has slowed, the underlying causes of conflict remain unresolved. Power struggles, ideological rivalries, regional competition, and shifting alliances continue to shape the security environment. At the same time, the global system itself appears increasingly fragmented, making coordinated international responses more difficult than ever. Following the devastating war in Gaza, a fragile calm has emerged between Israel and Hamas. Reconstruction efforts are slowly beginning, humanitarian aid is entering affected areas, and diplomatic negotiations aim to prevent renewed escalation. However, the situation remains highly fragile. Political divisions inside Israel, unresolved questions about Gaza's governance, and deep humanitarian needs create an environment where a single incident could quickly reignite violence. Beyond Gaza, Israel's northern border presents an even more complex challenge. Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese militant group backed by Iran, maintains a large arsenal of rockets, drones, and precision-guided missiles. During previous periods of tension, exchanges of fire across the Israel-Lebanon border have demonstrated how quickly localized incidents can escalate. Although both sides currently appear to prefer avoiding full-scale war, miscalculation remains a constant risk. Hezbollah's strategic posture is closely tied to Iran's regional influence. Iran supports multiple proxy groups across the Middle East, including militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. This network allows Tehran to exert pressure on adversaries without engaging in direct conventional warfare. However, this approach also increases the likelihood of indirect conflicts and regional escalation. The Houthis in Yemen represent another important dimension of Middle Eastern instability. Over recent years, the group has demonstrated growing military capabilities, including long-range drones and missile systems. Their ability to threaten shipping routes in the Red Sea and potentially target Israeli-linked interests has attracted significant international concern. Maritime security in this corridor is critical for global trade, energy shipments, and economic stability. Although some international naval coalitions have been established to protect commercial shipping, sustained insecurity in the Red Sea could disrupt supply chains and increase transportation costs worldwide. This illustrates how regional conflicts increasingly generate global economic consequences in an interconnected world. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue to reshape regional alignments. Some Arab states have expanded normalization agreements with Israel, seeking economic cooperation and technological partnerships. Others remain cautious, balancing domestic public opinion with strategic interests. Saudi Arabia's evolving foreign policy, including dialogue with Iran and regional mediation efforts, reflects a broader trend toward pragmatic diplomacy aimed at reducing direct confrontation. Yet normalization and diplomacy coexist with unresolved ideological conflicts, particularly surrounding Palestinian statehood, regional power balances, and security guarantees. These unresolved issues continue to generate tension beneath the surface, limiting the durability of any short-term stability. Beyond the Middle East, the global system faces structural challenges that amplify the risks of conflict. Great power competition between the United States, China, and Russia increasingly shapes international institutions, trade policies, technology development, and military planning. Rather than a unified international order, the world appears to be moving toward a more fragmented and multipolar structure. In such an environment, coordination becomes harder. International organizations struggle to enforce norms, mediate disputes, or mobilize collective action. Regional alliances become more important, but they also create competing blocs with diverging interests. Smaller states must navigate complex diplomatic landscapes, balancing security needs with economic partnerships. Technological change further complicates security dynamics. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, and space-based systems introduce new vulnerabilities and escalation pathways. Attacks may occur below the threshold of traditional warfare, blurring the line between peace and conflict. Attribution becomes difficult, increasing the risk of misinterpretation and unintended retaliation. Information warfare also plays a growing role. Disinformation campaigns, deepfakes, and social media manipulation can influence public opinion, destabilize political systems, and intensify polarization. Trust in institutions and media declines, making societies more vulnerable to manipulation during crises. Economic pressures add another layer of fragility. Inflation, debt, supply chain disruptions, and energy transitions strain national budgets and social stability. Economic insecurity can fuel populism, nationalism, and political polarization, reducing governments' willingness to compromise internationally. Trade fragmentation and protectionism may further weaken global growth and cooperation. Climate change remains a long-term threat multiplier. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, water scarcity, and food insecurity increase migration pressures and intensify competition over resources. Fragile states are particularly vulnerable, as climate shocks intersect with weak governance and existing conflicts. Over time, environmental stress may become one of the most significant drivers of instability worldwide. Despite these challenges, opportunities for cooperation still exist. Global health initiatives, climate adaptation projects, humanitarian coordination, and scientific collaboration demonstrate that shared interests can transcend political divisions. Regional confidence-building measures, arms control agreements, and economic integration initiatives can reduce mistrust and create incentives for stability. The central question facing the international community in 2025 is whether cooperation can keep pace with fragmentation. The choices made by political leaders, institutions, and societies will determine whether competition evolves into constructive rivalry or destructive confrontation. Preventing escalation requires diplomacy, transparency, crisis management mechanisms, and public resilience against misinformation. For individuals and communities, understanding these global dynamics becomes increasingly important. Education, media literacy, and cross-cultural dialogue can help reduce fear and misinformation. Economic adaptability and social cohesion strengthen societies against external shocks. While individuals cannot control geopolitics, informed citizens contribute to stability through responsible engagement and civic participation. As history has shown, periods of rapid change often carry both danger and opportunity. The world of 2025 stands at such a crossroads. The path chosen will shape not only the balance of power, but also the quality of life for billions of people. Whether humanity moves toward cooperation or deeper division remains uncertain, but awareness, dialogue, and thoughtful leadership offer the best hope for a more stable future.